you guys! So today's video is about racism. Racism exists in the USA and in France. This video is not about debating whether or not there's a presence of racism in the countries, nor am I going to compare whether one country is more or less racist than another. I'm rather going to explain how and why France and the USA are dealing with racism today. And what's interesting is you're going to see that there are more differences between the two countries than maybe you would have thought based on their history and also based on some of the different laws that are in place today. Two things before we get started. First thing, you know that I love comments, I love interacting with the community, and I especially love when people don't have the same point of view as me or opinion because it really gives me like an opportunity to see another angle of a subject. So feel free to leave comments on the video, but honestly, if any of those comments are racist, if any of them are hate speech, if you're not being respectful, I'm gonna have to delete them. So just as my mother always said, treat people the way you want to be treated and we should all be good. And finally, with everything going on in the world today, I have really started to understand that I lacked a lot of understanding about, the real definition of racism, what it really means, white supremacy, what the core movement Black Lives Matters means, and how I, as a white female, can really be an ally and a supporter to change the world and make it a better place for everybody. I'm really learning that speaking up is better than staying quiet, so hence my video today, and also that educating, my family, my community, my friends is really vital to making a change. So I've left a list in the description below of reading materials, of resources, of social media accounts, of podcasts, of you name it, from the Black community and from minorities that I'm using to listen, to read, to educate myself, and that I really would like you to do the same. So please don't hesitate to go and check that out. If we want to make the world a better place for the Black community and for everybody, it's up to all of us to take a stand against racism and do our part. All right, I think that's everything, so let's jump into the video. It's a heavy topic, but an important one. C'est parti! Okay. The first point, which is pretty major, is the fact that race doesn't actually exist in France in the same way that it does in the USA. The word race itself is really used in France for animals, for example, for like a race of a dog. It's really not a word used for humans. And a lot of this comes down to the French Constitution, which really sees the French population as a singular population. It's not composed of people with different ethnic origins or different religions or different beliefs. It's really an indivisible population that cannot be differentiated. And it actually says something in the Constitution about this. It says, La France est une république indivisible, laïque, démocratique et sociale. Elle assure l'égalité devant la loi de tous les citoyens, sans distinction d'origine, de race ou de religion. Elle respecte toutes les croyances, son organisation est décentralisée. And you can see this really concretely in the way that the majority of French people identify themselves. So it's very common to hear somebody in the US say, I'm African American, or I'm Irish American, or I'm Asian American. Friends, I've never heard this, and it's very rare to hear someone identify themselves as African French, for example, because as it goes back to this whole thing about the Constitution and we see the way that we see the population in France, you are French above all else. And so an important thing that still goes with this notion of not having race means that unlike in the US, where we have a lot of data about skin color, about ethnic origins, about religion on the population, in France, this is illegal. So the government isn't allowed to do these type of censuses. So they don't have the same type of data. They can't really tell you what percentage of their population is from North Africa or what percentage of their population is from Asia because they don't have access to this type of data. In the USA, the government has conducted a census every 10 years, and since the very beginning of these censuses in 1790, there has always been a question about racial identity. The very first census actually had 3 choices in the US. You were either free white, all other whites, or slaves, because there was a rule saying if you weren't 100% white, so if you had 1 drop of Black blood in you, then you weren't considered white because you weren't free white, you weren't 100% white. The responses have of course evolved over 200 years when they ask your feelings about your racial identity. With all of the data that we have, we can actually implement things like positive discrimination or affirmative action. So if we know that there is a university that's being very exclusive to minorities, we can say, hey, you've got to be more inclusive starting now. You need to make sure you recruit 50% of your next class should be from minorities. Or for example, with the police, when they're pulling over people, we can actually know how many blacks that they pull over versus how many white people. In France, because there's no data concretely about the color of your skin, it's harder to see how much discrimination is really happening. In France, for example, the police have the right to pull over any car whenever they want. In the US, you really have to have a reason. You have to have seen something that's illegal to pull them over. In France, the police can stop whatever car they want. And for example, we have no idea what criteria they're using to pull cars over. And we also don't have the data to prove whether or not they're taking into account racial identity. Now, since the French government can't maybe tackle racism as directly as they'd like, they can, of course, tackle other problems like poverty, for example. In the US, though, just because we have all of the data to show us concretely that racism exists doesn't mean that everybody wants to admit it or to recognize it. The USA was a major slave country. By the 1800s, we had over 600,000 slaves in the US, which means that the majority of Black Americans today are direct descendants of people that were forcefully taken from their home in Africa and brought over to the US. Well, France was a bit different because they were a colonial empire like Great Britain, and so they had territories all around the world, and they definitely had slavery in some of their colonies in the Americas, for example, but by as early as 1792, it was illegal to bring slaves back to metropolitan France, the France kind of that we know today. Contrary to the US, where the majority of the Black population is direct descendants of slaves, in France, the majority of the Black population actually came to France after World War II, when the country was completely destroyed and they were in desperate need of workers. So it was an opportunity for people to go abroad and to have work. This is really an important thing when it comes to racism, because in France you can really hear in like political speech and on the radio and on the news some of the most racist people saying, well, if the Black population isn't happy in France, they can just go back home. And you would never really hear this in the US, for example, like on the news, because a lot of the Black community, as I said, are direct descendants from slaves who were there probably long before a majority of their European white counterparts came over from Europe in the 1800s, for example. I mean, some of them have been here before the country was even the United States of America. So this is their home. So you wouldn't necessarily hear that type of speech the same way that I have recently heard that speech in France. Yet even if the American Black community is considered home by the most racist in the US, you can see that segregation went well into the 1900s in the US, really showing us how deep-rooted and legal and recent the problem is. Because when you look at France, legal segregation based on color didn't make it past the 1800s, so it's not as recent. While I've shown that there are some certain differences about racism in France and the US, there's also some basic things about racism that are still very true in both countries. For example, when you look at the prisons, the non-white population is overrepresented. Is this because the system has been so full of disadvantages for the Black community that they are therefore poorer and then therefore they resort more quickly to violence? Or is it because they are actually judged more severely than their white counterparts? Or is it a mix of both? Both countries regrouped their minority populations together, and the consequences of that were ghettos, poverty, higher unemployment, which eventually meant more eruptions of violence. So not only is the system set up to be a disadvantage for them, but so is also regrouping them in the same areas. And let's be honest, those areas are never in the most advantageous places to live in the cities, and especially not the easiest places to go to work and do something as basic as that. And finally, both countries have a white population that lacks empathy for the struggles that they're going through. The denial of the reality that Blacks face and that they can't just work harder when they're part of a system that's set up to systematically fail them no matter how hard they try, because they don't have the right resources and they don't have the right support, and they consequently don't have the right skin color to reach their goals in the same way that somebody else in their community with white skin can. All right, guys, that's a wrap on my video about racism in the USA and France. As you can see, we need radical change and we need a lot of support in order to change a system that's been a disadvantage for Blacks for such a long time. And it's up to everybody, including the white community who's benefited from this system for the last 200 years, to take a stand and support. I mentioned at the beginning of the video in the description below. Please go check them out, listen, read, share with your community. Of all of the videos on my channel, don't hesitate to share this one with as many people as you can so that we can educate everybody and that we can do, all of us can do our part to make the world a better place for everyone. All right, I'll see you guys next Wednesday.